Every year around this time, there are think pieces about whether or not it's still acceptable to say the word spooky. Some people are deeply offended by the term and others are like, huh? The simple explanation for why that is that starting around 2017, people started tweeting that spooky is offensive. If you haven't heard this one, I'll give you a second to guess why. Got your answer? Okay, so the word spook was historically used in limited contexts as another word for black people. Now, you might say that spook also means ghost or specter, and you'd be right. You could say that it refers sometimes to spies, and you'd be double right. And this is not the only word that people discuss this way. Not only does this come up around spooky and spade, but also around words like chairman and woman and history. And I'll discuss others in a minute. So the question is, should we cancel a regular word because some of its uses can be offensive or derogatory when others aren't? What about words that evoke offensive words but are unrelated, like this word for being miserly? What about when a word in another language sounds like an offensive term in ours? You probably already have strong opinions on this. I know I do. And you probably think the stakes are so low it doesn't matter, but at least one person lost his job for saying a word that's unrelated to a slur but contains the sounds of that word in the same order. And there's actually multi-billion-dollar companies that pay good money to answer questions like, should we cancel the word spooky? I once assembled a wildly diverse team of 10 linguists to evaluate almost 800 words for a company you've definitely heard of to evaluate a product you've almost certainly used at some point. That's a very, very interesting story, but we all signed an NDA, which would be worth 4 points if initialisms were allowed. So there's very real stakes to this kind of question, above and beyond the fact that I'm wading into a morass of hurt feelings and worse, think pieces, often involving my academic colleagues and family friends. But also, this is a linguistics channel, and these questions are both social and, well, linguistic. And linguistics has a lot of light to shed on this topic, from how words can mean different things to what happens in the brain and body when we hear them. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I've got a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and one of the research topics I publish on from time to time happens to be taboo words, offensive language, and language change. We have fun on the channel. So today, we're going to ask, should you call a spade, or should we err on the side of not triggering others, even if we think they're wrong? I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is Language Jones. This video is not sponsored by anybody because, I mean, come on. But if you like what I'm doing with the channel, you can support the channel right here with super thanks or on Patreon at www.patreon.com/languagejones. So you know that saying that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me? Turns out, perhaps unsurprisingly, that it's not entirely true, as anyone who's ever attended 5th grade and remembers it knows. But we'll get into that in a second. First, I want to share the most extreme case I have ever experienced. It was consulting for an organization where an individual who worked for them took offense at an idiom used by their colleagues. The phrase was calling a jumbled, messed up situation a goat rope. This is primarily a military and law enforcement thing if you've never heard it before, and it describes, quote, a confusing, disorganized situation, often attributed to or marked by human error, or a convoluted issue that is contested by many parties. Its origin is, of course, a rodeo event in which children are asked to lasso a goat. Multiple kids. It looks like this. By the way, please leave me a comment with your favorite unusual expression. I love these. So this employee was offended and said that any mention of rope should not be made around black people because it evokes negative parts of America's past. This is really dark. And predictably, some people responded by deciding that was ridiculous and intentionally working in as many rope-related idioms as possible. Show the new guy the ropes. I got roped into this task. I'm at the end of my rope. Let me run that up the flagpole. Evidently, some might have been using ostensibly innocuous phrases precisely because they now knew it would upset that employee, and they wanted to give them the opportunity to appear hysterical and ridiculous and oversensitive. They wanted to give them enough rope to hang themselves, so to speak. Now, there's something important to recognize here. For this employee, it was already a toxic workplace. So the rope thing was just something they fixated on, but the goat rope wasn't the real problem. It was just their way of articulating the problem and was the straw that broke the camel's back. And that's the first piece to think about here. Context is everything. Dr. Renee Blake at NYU said as much when interviewed by Leah Donnella for NPR's Code Switch about the word spooky in 2017. Who's in the room changes how a word might be received. Of course, what the room is changes the context too. Good luck getting a room full of sailors to not use rope-related idioms. But also, we kind of think of words as just these permanent things that always mean the same thing, and that's just not how words work. Let's take spooky, for example. Spook entered English via Dutch and meant ghost or specter, but words take on new meanings and new shades of meaning. Shades of meaning. By the 1930s, spook was being used to mean white people by musicians like Cab Calloway, because pale, like ghosts. Ironic, given that this is Cab Calloway.
Find another sweet man like me. Now when I die, bear me in my straight leg breeches.
It was also being used to refer to black people because I guess they could jump out from the dark or whatever. Oh, and it also referred to rookie pilots. The Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, referred to themselves as the Spookwaffe, proudly mocking the Luftwaffe, which is so badass. By the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, it was also being used to refer to spies, again, lurking in the shadows. Place definitely affects things too, so I've recently heard people in Washington, D.C. say things like, he was with the company, he's a retired spook. That might not mean remotely the same thing coming from someone who's not a Beltway insider. I guess, so far, Tom Clancy fans are coming out in the clear on all of these. By the 1970s, spook was being used with a derogatory flavor to refer to black people, as in the film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, with Sidney Poitier, not Ashton Kutcher. And it's this last meaning that people object to, but once a word has a meaning like that, does it lose its other meanings? Well, no. So let's get technical. You have the referent. That's the thing in the world you're referring to with words. Then you have the denotation and connotation. Denotation is literally what you're picking out, what you mean with the word. And connotation is exactly what it sounds like, sort of what the word evokes. So the word queen has a few different denotations. It can be a female monarch. It can be a chess piece. If I say, the queen is dead, long live the king, I'm probably discussing the referent Queen Elizabeth. If I say the queen can move in any direction, but the bishop can only move diagonally, the referent is probably a chess piece. But of course, context has a say as well. And if I call my best friend a sassy little queen, the referent is the friend, the denotation is a prissy and effeminate person, and the connotation is a playfully derogatory connotation. Context is going to determine whether they're offended, or call me a silly little weenie and then we have a laugh, high five, and another beer or whatever. So, spook has a ton of different denotations, including ghosts, spies, fighter pilots, white jazz musicians in the 1930s, or black silver screen icons who've been invited to a now very uncomfortable dinner. And different referents and contexts can determine wildly different connotations. The sentence, your girlfriend lives in the corner penthouse of Spook Central, will mean something completely different depending on whether it's a Proud Boy criticizing another white guy for dating a woman who lives in Central Harlem, versus a character in a John le Carré novel talking about a bugged hotel room where a honeypot operation is happening, versus when Ray Stantz is telling Peter Venkman that Dana Barnett is living in a building that is a huge superconductive antenna that was designed and built expressly for the purpose of pulling in and concentrating spiritual turbulence.
Is a huge superconductive antenna that was designed and built expressly for the purpose of pulling in and concentrating spiritual turbulence. Your girlfriend lives in the corner penthouse of Spook Central.
So context, referent, denotation, and connotation all are important. But as with the goat rope I mentioned earlier, there's also the fact that we can play with these things with implicature. That's the technical term for implying things that we can then have plausible deniability about. Or even dogwhistle, which is the technical term for saying something that evokes one thing for one group of people, but has another secondary meaning for a subset of people. A classic linguistics paper on the subject talks about George Bush discussing wonder-working power, which sounds great no matter what, but doubly great and meaningful to evangelical Christians. It's called dog whistle after those whistles that are a high frequency that only dogs can hear. The rope shenanigans were potentially a plausibly deniable dog whistle, or not. That's the whole point of dog whistle and implicature. You can't be sure in the same way as if they had said something more direct and offensive. But remember when I mentioned sticks and stones? Well, here's the thing. First of all, when I say a word that sounds similar to a slur, there's a lot of evidence that at least partially it activates that part of the brain. It's lexical priming. If nothing else, it's easier to recognize or recall the offensive word for a while afterwards. This is bad news for anyone speaking Chinese and having a tip of the tongue moment, since their word for sounds like a potentially offensive word in English. But also, let's say you're offended by the word spade, when the denotation is black people. For those of you who don't know, there's an outdated derogatory term for black people inspired by the color of the playing cards. Are you then right to be offended when someone wants to quit beating around the bush and call a spade a spade? Is beating around the bush starting to sound worse than usual given the current context? Pause. Anyway, the origin of that spade phrase predates the concept of black people as a racial group, or even the modern concept of race at all. But can we really expect anybody to know that? This is just the etymological fallacy. Words don't mean what they used to mean, they mean what we use them to mean, and assume they mean now. And dictionaries just describe that. Side note, the original phrase is the Greek proverb to call a bowl, but evidently Erasmus mistook skape, bowl, for a derivative of skaptein, to dig, and now we have a shovel-related term from a random Dutch dude in the Northern Renaissance in the 1500s. Maybe we could just sidestep the whole thing by talking about bowls in Greek. The etymological fallacy is particularly tempting, at least to me, with words that end in men. Not men, but men. That word historically meant person, especially before English had the word person, which we got after a guy named William the Conqueror did a conquest. The word that meant a male adult human was actually were, as in werewolf. Werewolves will make an appearance later, by the way. A female werewolf? A whiff-wolf. Because whiff didn't mean wife, it meant woman. Midwife doesn't mean middle wife, it means with woman. And woman is basically from whiffman, so a lady person. So chairman of the board doesn't necessarily mean a male chief of staff. Although the chairman of the board were coincidentally all male, but I'm sure they'd have women too if they just had more time. So changing chairman to chairperson is literally placing the English word for person with the French borrowing for the exact same word. But here's the thing. If nobody knows that man meant person, and nobody thinks that man means person now, does it? Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
Here's the weird issue, though. When we hear really hurtful things directed at us, our mental and emotional responses have measurable physical correlates. That is, words hurt. So my words can hurt you, even if I don't mean them to. So what do we do with that information? Especially given that if we work hard enough, we can make anything sound bad. When you've reviewed over 700 slurs, insults, scatological references, and sexual allusions for a client, once you get to a word like suckhole, which refers to a pit of quicksand, it's hard not to immediately respond with, ew, gross, and feel a little queasy. I tend to lean toward the side that recognizes that words can hurt, but still distinguishes between literal violence and, well, literal violence. I mean, I wouldn't recommend working on coming up with a scathing bon mot as a valid strategy for winning an MMA fight, but they can hurt a little bit. I'd take a YouTube comment section over a round with Mike Tyson any day. And if we're looking to have hurt feelings, we can always find a way to have our feelings hurt. If we're starting from a place of hurt, we can always find a way to project it and justify it externally. I think one of the great American values is freedom of speech, and the fact that we find ourselves in conversation with people from wildly different backgrounds and perspectives, some of which we're bound to find offensive or even hurtful. But there's a level of individual responsibility for a modicum of mental fortitude that we should all at least strive to possess. At the same time, when someone is deeply wounded, figuratively, we should recognize that and have sympathy, maybe a modicum of understanding. And also just recognize when the world has changed and deal with it. I can be technically correct about another word for miserly, but I'd rather just say miserly and have a job than insist on saying a word that predates its offensive counterpart by 500 years and be technically right, but also unemployed. Of course, there's a line there as well. I was once at a cafe and told the barista, I'm going to go hit the head as I walked towards the facilities. The head is naval jargon for the toilet, and I know that as a stock phrase for visiting the bathroom. Turns out he didn't know that, and he was deeply offended and tried to prevent me from using the bathroom until it was explained. He thought I'd declared an intent to misuse the facilities. Similarly, I once had someone offended when I jokingly asked for a pastry to be cleft in twain. Evidently, they didn't know the past tense of cleave and only knew the noun in naughty contexts. In these instances, I maintain it's for the other person to maybe crack a book once in a while and get their heads out of the gutter. But I also now exclusively say either I need to make a head call, I'll be in my thinking place, or I need to see a man about a horse. The latter is almost never understood, but nobody's offended. And because it's delightfully Damon Runyon-esque, I'm not gonna stop.
I got the horse right here, the name is Paul Revere, and here's a guy that says if the weather's clear, can do.
Please leave me a comment with a time that you had a misunderstanding like this, by the way. I'm sure we could all use a good laugh. So I guess another element is whether it's a single person's idiosyncrasies or a lot of people. The fact that a lot of people didn't know the word dotard was a political scandal a while ago, but evidently enough did know it that it didn't gain real traction. When one person says spooky is offensive to all black people, it only takes one instance of Donald Glover doing voice acting for Tracy Morgan, playing Tracy Jordan, playing Michael Jackson, playing a Jewish werewolf in a song mocking both Thriller and the Monster Mash to disprove that.
Werewolf for mitzvah, spooky, scary. Boys becoming men, men becoming wolves.
I told you werewolves would be back. Researching for this video, I thought, you don't hear a lot about whiff wolves. Turns out I forgot about Rule 34 and furries more broadly. I really should use Safe Search more often. Okay, so on that note, if you're watching this in October and you observe, or whatever the word is for Halloween, I'm going to wish you what the folks here in Harlem are using, a spooktacular Halloween. I won't be upset that Halloween reminds me of the time that sassy little queen called me a weenie and it hurt my feelings. Thanks to all my patrons, and if you like this video, YouTube thinks you'll like this one.